Good evening, everyone. I noticed that people are beginning to stream in now. The numbers are increasing on screen. So just by way of introduction, my name is Timmy Frawley. I am a member of the UCD Neurodiversity team, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues on the team, Ken Kilbride and of course Beth Kilkenny. But we're also joined, I'm very pleased to report, by Qona Rankin. And Qona is somebody I heard speak at a conference during the pandemic about 18 months ago. But for those of you who haven't heard Qona speak before, she was appointed the first Dyslexia Co-ordinator at the Royal College of Art in 2002. And her academic research focuses on looking for links between dyslexia, dyspraxia, and drawing from observation. And she recently co-authored a book on the subject. She has spoken at many conferences in both the UK and abroad, and has had various papers published. In addition, Qona set up and manages Creative Mentors Foundation. The aim of this charity is to help make the arts curriculum at state schools more accessible and rewarding for dyslexic and dyspraxic children. A very noble and worthy initiative, I must say. Qona continues to design and make jewellery from her workshop in East London, which is something I didn't actually know. And in 2008, she was awarded a fellowship of the RCA in recognition of her services to dyslexia support. She is a fellow of the RSA and a member of their education group. So again, I think this is another, I think, excellent opportunity to hear from an expert in this series. So without further ado, over to you, Qona, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Timmy, for that very flattering introduction. I'm going to now share my screen. And as if by magic, play my PowerPoint. So good evening, everybody. You'll see some highly recognizable faces here. And I wonder if you know what they've all got in common, these people. Well, the first is they've contributed enormously to the UK economy. And the second is that they are all dyslexic. The context in which I work is postgraduate art and design education at the Royal College of Art, where I've been working as the Dyslexia Co-ordinator, as Timmy said, since 2002, and where a third of our students and probably staff have dyslexia and/or dyspraxia. This percentage is not exclusive to the RCA. Other art and design university departments in the UK report a similar percentage. So I think it's interesting to consider why that should be so and how organisations and public policy can redefine how they approach dyslexia to increase the creative contribution people with dyslexia can make to the UK in the future. But first of all, I want to share with you some of the brilliance and creativity of our dyslexic and dyspraxic students and staff. And I'm going to begin by showing you 9 slides, which I think are fantastic examples of this. One of our fashion lecturers, Julian Roberts, who's dyslexic, has severe directional confusion. He spoke about this in a recent lecture and said, disorientation is geometrically very useful, allowing me and my students to design unpredictable silhouettes never before constructed. He says he works backwards and describes his design process as a bit like a moth, making holes in the fabric and then fitting the body through the holes and encouraging the structure to emerge. He calls it subtraction cutting, which is, I guess, a bit like how a sculptor carving in stone would work. Julian's a well-respected university lecturer and teaches all over the UK, the USA and Brazil. Katie Spragg is a tutor in our ceramics department. Katie makes the most stunning porcelain landscapes. Combining clay with a range of processes, including animation and installation, she creates work that aims to arouse curiosity. Her current work explores our relationship with nature, specifically the ways that humans and plants coexist. She hopes to motivate an appreciation for the natural world, yet not be elitist about the environments that are revered, to see value in the overlooked nature that exist in urban spaces, as well as vast natural landscapes. Jo Hayes Ward, a graduate from the Jewellery and Metalwork School, has many prestigious awards, including from the Craft Council and the Goldsmiths Fair Craftsmanship and Design Awards. Her work is also in a number of permanent collections, including the Goldsmiths Company, Modern Jewellery Collection, and the Crafts Council collections. This is her first piece of public art for Hammersmith's newly rebuilt Riverside Studios. I love the way Jo's included so many different elements and textures within the sculpture, which you can imagine reflecting the sprawl of the city, the ebb and flow of the river, the diverse cultures of the people, and the coming together of ideas and creativity at Riverside Studios. Henry Franks graduated from our product design school in 2015. Henry said, "I channel my dyslexia into my creative practice, where it allows me to make these changes and produce objects for others to look at and wonder about." Dyslexic Objects is a range of household products he designed in response to his own dyslexic condition. His aim was to improve a selection of everyday objects through the addition of dyslexia, encouraging people to re-engage with seemingly inanimate objects. Each product possesses a different characteristic of the condition. For example, the confused coat hanger, which you can see here, wasn't paying attention when it was being told which way round it was supposed to be, because it was daydreaming about whales, note the whale tail shape, and as a result has a double hooked head. The benefit of this is that it can hang either way round when hanging your clothes up, so you don't have to turn the hang around. Henry started his own award-winning London-based design consultancy called Doublon, which creates exciting experiences and immersive environments. If you went to the Royal Academy Summer Show in 2019, you might have seen a large Victorian-looking specimen case with a feathered sort of beast inside it. It was made by Kate Maguire, who graduated from the RCA Sculpture School. This was a work she made when she was a student, and I love the irony of it. It's called Fume, and she's literally burnt her way through the book so that you can see your way through to the end, perhaps reflecting her own difficulties with reading at school, which she found very hard. It could also describe her state of mind when she was trying to read, but unable to sustain her concentration. Kate is now an internationally renowned British sculptor whose practice probes the beauty inherent in duality. She recently wrote, "At the RCA, I was tested for dyslexia, and the results showed that I was extremely dyslexic. I scored 97% in nonverbal and 3% in verbal reasoning. I was 38. Can you imagine how it felt to finally be able to explain the embarrassment and shame I'd felt all my life?" Photographer graduate Simon Cunningham is intrigued by visual perceptual differences. He calls this photograph Baby Knee. He wrote, "I enjoy the collapse and uncertainty between inside and out. This is the territory. I don't want the image fixed and stable, but to occupy an in-between state, dynamic and in the process of becoming free to drift." Simon continues to exhibit his work and is a lecturer on the photography course at Arts University, Bournemouth. Edward Barber and Jay Oskerby designed this chair when they were architecture students. Edward, who's dyspraxic and always found sitting still at school very hard, wanted to create a chair that enabled school children to move around on their chairs. This chair is now part of the Vitra collection, and Barbara Oskerby now has a range of products Their collaborative work has probed the interface between industrial design, furniture design, and architecture. Winner of the Royal Television Society Student Awards 2017 postgraduate animation was Josh Saunders, who was a student on our MA animation course. The judges commented, "Occasionally, animation can deliver an idea or feeling or emotion in a way that no other medium can. This film is a prime example of this, exploring mental illness with a fluidity of thought and imagery that only animation can achieve." Josh told me that understanding what it feels like to live with a dyslexic brain requires a leap of intelligence, and visual metaphors can be very powerful. It can feel like kicking an elephant through a cat flap. He also told me about the incredible frustration he felt of brimming with ideas with no clear way to get them out until he discovered communicating visually. Josh now leads drawing for animation on the BA animation course at Farnham, and he continues to run his own animation studio. So now moving on to the second part of my talk to consider why it might be that individuals with dyslexia and dyspraxia might have enhanced visual spatial ability. It may be that because these people found academic subjects harder than others, but discovered that the art room was a less judgmental and a more inclusive environment, that they chose to spend more time there and got encouragement and acknowledgement, but also better at it. But it also might be to do with the way the brain processes information. So I'd like you to imagine two brains, brain A and brain B. Both brains belong to recent graduates who are looking for jobs in film production. One brain is neurotypical and the other neurodiverse, in this case, dyslexic. They set off on bikes to meet a friend at the Black Lion, which is a local pub to me. Brain A and Brain B set off in the right direction. However, Brain A gets distracted by the fork in the road, sees the river. Is that a police boat? What drama is this? Meanwhile, Brain B continues on his journey. Look at the texture on that tree. It's beautiful. Maybe I could use that for a piece of jewellery. That's strange. That bit looks a bit like a face. I wonder if there's a man in the tree. What is the guy on the barge thinking about? Why is he so far away from the other man? I wonder if they can talk to each other on the telephone. It's so strange, this habit of taking selfies. They've got the dog with them as well. Oh, look at that lovely building. Could be a great place for a location. Oh no, I think I'm lost. And indeed, Brain A is lost, but sees a stranger and stops to ask the way. It turns out the stranger has a film production company and they swap contact details. Far-fetched, perhaps, but it's possible that the neurodiverse brain, which may be perceived as unreliable because of their poor timekeeping, has actually not only won the day in terms of a potential job, but has also added to their wealth of visual experience for future reference. Up until about 10 years ago, dyslexia was mostly looked at as a deficit or disadvantage. But then in 2011, Brock and Fernette Eade wrote a best-selling book called The Dyslexic Advantage, which introduced a more positive way of thinking about dyslexia and showed the advantages of being dyslexic, such as being creative and thinking creatively. More recently, in 2015, Rod Nicholson's Positive Dyslexia promoted the creative abilities of many dyslexic people, such as being a holistic thinker, thinking outside the box, being really good at improvising with words and music, having good 3D visual spatial skills, being empathetic, intuitive and tenacious, having multiple perceptual views and making people laugh, sometimes unintentionally. Margaret Rook's book, Dyslexia is My Superpower Most of the Time, brought together over 100 children and teenagers who talked about their dyslexic strengths. Her books, Creative Successful Dyslexic and Adult Dyslexia, Unleashing Your Limitless Power, both testify that there is absolutely no doubt that it's possible to have a successful career as a dyslexic adult. And the Bigger Picture book of Amazing Dyslexics and the Jobs They Do by Kate Power and Kathy Forsyth has many examples of some really famous dyslexics, including artists, designers, and architects. In this book, you can read about the unique dyslexic way of thinking and how people have coped with the processing differences that many dyslexic people have, and how their dyslexia and unique way of thinking has enabled them to get to be at the top of their professions. So I hope I've convinced you, in case you need convincing, that dyslexic, dyspraxic brains have the potential to be exceptionally creative because of the way they process information. In fact, dyslexic, dyspraxic creative strengths are now being acknowledged by a wide community. Diversity of thought in the media and technology fields is becoming increasingly valued. And interestingly, some architectural and design businesses look specifically to recruit people with dyslexia. Microsoft and Goldman Sachs have recently started initiatives specifically aimed at recruiting neurodiverse individuals by altering the interview process so it's much more inclusive. And GCHQ's apprentices are 4 times more likely to be dyslexic because they're hired for their lateral thinking and pattern recognition skills. And Universal Music launched the first ever handbook for embracing diversity in the creative industries. But unfortunately, not all employers are as enlightened as this. So what can we as individuals do to help employers understand our strengths and appreciate why some tasks might be harder, and what sort of support would be helpful? I think firstly, training for all managers is essential. The training would focus on how an institution could support staff who are neurodiverse and potentially what policies could be put in place to support them. And there are many excellent providers of this type of training. In my own institution, I put together, in consultation with dyslexic and dyspraxic colleagues, a wish list which would go some way towards leveling the playing field for all of our dyslexic and dyspraxic colleagues. We've divided the list into 4 sections: meetings, emails, policy, and procedural documents and general. So meetings, let's have a clear length and purpose stated and a reasonable agenda. Meetings should be no longer than 45 minutes. Papers for meetings can be circulated at least 3 days prior to the meeting in a format that can be read by a computer. Questions in advance or after a meeting should be allowed so that there's time for people to actually work out what it is, what question they want to ask, and acceptance that we all have the right to record meetings without gaining permission. Awareness that online meetings, which demand multitasking, i.e. speaking, listening, commenting in the chat, tracking the chat facilities, which continuously scroll, can be extremely stressful and exhausting. So emails, don't write lengthy emails full of dense information. If an email is more than 3 sentences, I would recommend a meeting. Don't expect lengthy emails back in return. And don't default to emails as a way of communication. With policy and procedure documents, inclusion in selection processes for new or additional systems, I think is really important. We've got a finance system called Aggresso, which you have to use if you want to claim money back. And it's so dyslexia unfriendly. I can't use it at all, and lots of my colleagues can't either. Google Documents are confusing as there's no sense of where the things are stored. Clear signposting throughout all of the information and of where the information is stored is really useful. Support when having to write lengthy college documents and acknowledgement that extra time might be needed. Policy and procedures documents could be explained in other mediums, such as short videos or talking heads. And for general The general advice, reasonable deadlines. We often receive work to do late and without warning, and we're expected to make up the difference. There should be a clear workload allocation and management systems put in place. Interestingly, this was done with union agreement at Brighton and succeeded in making the many small and often competing tasks that are invisible and unaccountable possible to map against contracts. And in the case of ND staff, neurodiverse staff, build in an agreed compensation. Assistance with bid writing and dedicated trained support in the research office is vital. Communicating instructions slowly and clearly is very helpful. And perhaps a wayfinding video of buildings so that you can navigate your way around a building before you actually enter it, which might stop you getting lost on your way to the lecture theatre or whatever. I did give this wish list to our HR department, but I'm still waiting to hear back from them. Anyway, so access to work, employees can get grants through the government scheme Access to Work. This can provide equipment, mentoring and digital programs to help those with learning difficulties and disabilities work better. This is free for all employees who fit the criteria and could actually revolutionize the way some of us work. Try to utilize people's natural strengths. Consider which tasks your dyslexic team member can lead on versus which ones they might need support on. And I think for dyslexic people, being open about their dyslexia, their dyspraxia is so important. If you're living and working with a learning difficulty, it might feel easier to hide it. However, it stops your team and your workplace from supporting you fully, and it only makes the 9 to 5 slot harder for everyone. I'm often asked by parents, what's the best way of helping their dyslexic and dyspraxic children? Sadly, it seems to me that having dyslexia in many schools could be compared to running a sports day hurdle event, where lots of children successfully jump the hurdles and finish the race, but not all, some fail. If there were options to go underneath, climb over or around the hurdles, or a prize for coming up with the most creative solution, it would enable many more to complete the race with their self-confidence intact. Wouldn't it be great if our policymakers committed to acknowledging alternative ways of achieving academic excellence at school? But sadly, that's not mostly the case. I would argue that school is the hardest time for our dyslexic and dyspraxic children. If they can survive school with their self-confidence intact, then, as we've seen, they can go on to have fulfilling and rewarding lives and can make huge contributions to the UK economy. So find out what your child is good at and encourage that talent, whatever it is. If you can find an inspiring adult in that field who can act as a mentor, even better. Take your child to the football match, the comedy show, the skateboard park, the art gallery. Watch YouTube videos with them. It's amazing how confidence and acknowledgement gained in something has a habit of migrating into other areas of the curriculum. And we've seen this a lot with our charity, the Creative Mentors Foundation. There is hope for future generations, though, with Matt Hancock's dyslexia screening bill, which will receive its second reading in September. The bill asks that leave be given to bring in a bill to require screening for dyslexia in primary schools, to make provision about the teaching and assessment of children found by that screening to have dyslexia, and for connected purposes. Now, I'm about to end, and I know it's annoying when during a presentation words on slide are read out, but I want to end with part of a letter that one of our students, Sylvain Vignier, wrote just before she graduated. These are her words, and I'm going to play a recording of Sylvain reading it. And I hope you'll agree that the expression in Sylvain's voice adds extra power to the words. The letter began, "Dear world."
By taking actions, we change. By accepting, we build. By challenging, we adapt. You and I have the power to deconstruct the norms and behaviors that make society's idea of what is normative and acceptable, to split apart whatever constitutes normality. It is urgent to break barriers that impede members of our society to study, get a job, to access the culture, to live independently.
Thank you very much.
I'm on mute.
No, you're okay now.
Super. And thank you, Qona, for a really excellent presentation, very insightful and delivered with such clarity. Beautiful mix of slides as well, I must say. Listening to your presentation, I just have a couple of questions. I was struck by your image of the hurdles and the idea that actually there's more than one way to navigate a hurdle. We can go under it, we can go around it, we can be creative. Unfortunately, I notice that some employers and some industries are very rigid. Indeed, some higher education institutes can be very rigid in how, I guess, the achievement of certain outcomes or competencies are assessed. And there can be, in some contexts, there can be a resistance to look at other methods and other approaches other than perhaps through the medium of reading, for example. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you've answered it already when you said we have the power to construct and to challenge and create a better society. But do you have any advice for those situations where we might meet a college lecturer, or we might meet an employer who says, well, no, I can't make any reasonable accommodations? How can we challenge that, do you think?
I don't know. It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, you know, they have to, by law, they have to, otherwise they're discriminating. But, you know, that doesn't always work. I mean, in my own institution, I haven't been very successful in terms of staff, you know, very successful in terms of the students, but sadly not in terms of the staff. The systems, a lot of the systems that are used, I think, you know, generally in universities are very undyslexic friendly. The sort of administrative workload seems to have got more and more, constantly having to fill in forms for funding and research, you know, forms as well for the research excellence framework. It's very, very difficult. I mean, I think all we can do is just keep on and on and on. And there are some very good charities now. I mean, last night I was at an event by a charity called The Future is ND. And it was actually a stand-up comic event with 5 autistic comedians. And that was an awareness raising event. And so I suppose we can support, you know, we can try and support charities that are trying to make a difference, that are trying to educate industry. But I mean, basically, Matt Hancock is dyslexic. We need more MPs to sort of come out and say that they have learning differences, because it strikes me that that's where the changes have to come from the top in a way, don't they? Because we don't have that power to make those changes.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, you know, the terminology is important too. You mentioned learning differences. And I feel that this is important in terms of sending a message that, well, difference is something which we celebrate actually within any ecosystem. But I think some of the nomenclature of the past wasn't always helpful. I've come to be aware of many supports actually within the community. For example, here in Ireland, the Dyslexia Association of Ireland and others, I think, are making access to diagnosis perhaps easier than it might have been a decade ago. Yet I know many people have difficulty accessing a valid and appropriate assessment. And I wonder, from the UK perspective, you mentioned the work of Matt Hancock and others, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I haven't read the whole bill, I'll be honest. As I understand it, he is aiming to have any child who has a sort of question mark over their head, dyslexia question mark, the right to assessment, and then leading on from that, the help to support that child. Because at the moment, schools have limited budgets for paying for assessments. And so obviously they, you know, if there's a child that may be struggling, but is struggling quietly, and typically, interestingly, they're not more boys with dyslexia than girls. It's just that boys tend to make more of a nuisance of themselves in the classroom if they can't understand things. Whereas girls, I mean, not always, obviously, but girls' tendency is to just sort of switch off and daydream and make up stories in their heads and not make too much of a fuss. So the girls often get overlooked. Interestingly, here with our students, I quite often, if I'm screening a student, a female student, they'll say to me, "Oh yeah, my brother's dyslexic." But obviously, you know, the parents it didn't occur to the parents that the daughter could also be dyslexic, you know.
Okay, and I know Ken and Beth will take some questions from our listeners now this evening. I'm conscious that I focused a little much on dyslexia and didn't mention dyspraxia, but I know there will be questions on that area too. So Beth and Ken, if you have any questions that you'd like to highlight for Qona.
Just jump in there with a very quick one, and just for, you know, this is probably a more personal one than anything else in terms of my own development. In that, you know, I've been doing a talk for an American tech company on neurodiversity in the workplace, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week. So I was interested when you mentioned that Microsoft has developed a plan to remove bias from the recruitment system. And that's one of the things that did come up this afternoon when we were talking to them. So I was just wondering if you could maybe just give me sort of practical things that they would be doing to take the bias out of the system around neurodiversity.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know what that includes. I just read a report that said that they were working on trying to make their recruitment system more inclusive for neurodiverse individuals. I mean, it would be interesting to know what that.
Yes, that's what.
Yeah.
I didn't know the answer myself.
No. I mean, I would imagine maybe sending them a list of questions before the interview, or interviewing in a less formal context. I don't know. Allowing them to have notes with them, that sort of thing. I
mean, just for myself then, just in terms of, you know, we would do talks. We're ADHD Island, but we do talks on neurodiversity. The vast majority that are employers in the organization who would be ASD, autism, and probably pretty sure of those with dyslexia. Not so sure about ADHD, but getting there. Dyspraxia is tend to be one that doesn't get talked about.
Right. Interestingly, we're getting more and more sort of comorbid diagnoses with our students, either primarily dyspraxic and a little bit dyslexic, or the other way around. The majority of our students the majority of the students that I see on my database have a diagnosis of both. I do have students that are just dyslexic or just dyspraxic, but increasingly ADD, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder come into it as well. And I guess, you know, we're all learning more about it all the time, which is possibly one reason why.
Okay. I see someone just said a link there into chat. Already looked up. Thanks, Elena. So I'll be borrowing that. Thank you very much. And seeing what it says.
Great. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Does Beth want to go, or I keep going?
Yeah, I'll take one of these questions from the Q&A then. And thanks, Qona. I thought that was a really great presentation. It was really fascinating to see all of the creativity, especially at the beginning, and kind of different presentation than what we've seen today. So it's really great. Thank you. So this question is from Katya, I think it is. She says, "Hi, Qona. My son is dyslexic and dyspraxic and has a beautiful, vivid visual imagination. He can see complete movies in his mind's eye. However, he's not very good fine motorically, so has always detested drawing or other arts and crafts assignments. Do you have any advice what he could try out to discover his creative side?"
I wonder if he's tried drawing on a computer. That can sometimes be helpful. And also copying drawings, sort of sometimes tracing over drawings can help to control that eye-hand coordination. It's really just practice, I think. I mean, I know it is difficult, but I also know that a lot of our jewelers are dyspraxic. A lot of our, ceramic students who do very small, precious work are dyspraxic. I don't think it need block the way. And certainly, if he can see whole movies in his head, I mean, he could build some Lego characters and create a movie on iMovie or something like that on the computer. It's quite easy to do now with certainly with sort of Mac software. You don't have to draw to create films, animations. But I would encourage him to learn to draw as well, because I think, as I said, Josh Saunders who's won the award that I showed you. He has a very sort of fluid way of drawing. You might not think it's, it doesn't look like particularly like a real figure or anything, but it's a very attractive way of drawing, I think.
That's great. Katya says, thank you, and she'll suggest it to him. He certainly has great hand-eye coordination in gaming, she says. So.
Tell him to look at Quentin Blake. His drawings are lovely and very free.
That's great, thanks. We have another question here from Lorna, who says, "I wondered whether you had also found an increase in mental health disorders comorbidly occurring with developmental disorders, and how has this affected their artwork?"
Yeah, I mean, sadly, since COVID, since lockdown, and I don't know whether that's to do with lockdown and the effect that that's had on people's mental health. So, for our students and for your students too, students who are now in the second year, they've sort of had 2 years of COVID. And, I've spoken to students who've hardly been in college, and they've hardly met any of their other peers, in their year group. And I think that's makes you feel very lonely and depressed and isolated. And particularly, some of the students from abroad, they haven't even come to the UK. Some of our Chinese students, Korean students, Japanese students. So they do feel very isolated and depressed and lonely. So yes, I have noticed an increase in that. I don't know why. I don't know why that is. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
And let me see if I can find it there. How has it affected their artwork or their creativity?
That's hard to say, because I don't think you can separate. You can't really separate that, I don't think. I think it's the whole person making art with all of their brain. Whatever that brain holds will be expressed through their art. I don't think you could make a judgment about that. I certainly couldn't make a judgment about that.
Would you say, Qona, that there are obstacles to creativity by people with dyslexia or dyspraxia, or would you say it's more that they can use creativity to overcome other barriers, say in education or in the workplace?
I think they can use creativity to overcome barriers in education. I mean, that's why we started our charity, was because I felt that lots and lots of dyslexic and dyspraxic children have the potential to be creative. But sadly, at secondary school now, certainly in the UK, because of the exam systems, art is taught, well, if it is still taught, and that has been cut down as well. And a lot of state schools have very little art anyway. But when it is taught in secondary school, it's taught in quite a sort of formulaic way. And for the GCSE and the A-level exams, you have to do quite a lot of writing about it. You have to post-rationalize how you've arrived at a composition or whatever. And that is true in music as well, and drama, actually. So when we started Creative Mentors, we actually wanted to be in all three areas, but that was just too big a job. So we've stuck with what we know about, which is art and design. And I've noticed that children who get encouragement and acknowledgement, neurodiverse children within the art studio, that other teachers from other areas have actually said, you know, this child's English has improved so much, and it's just to do with confidence. And then the other bit of you were saying, did I think it impedes them? No, not at all. I think it's a real plus, because I think you think in a much less formulaic, less predictable way, I would say.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But,
Go ahead,
the next question just coming from Vianna Clay. And so what are your thoughts on the use of AI and similar digital interfaces for dyslexic and dyspraxic students and artists? Are you familiar with any new developments in the area that you would think would be particularly useful to a neurodivergent community?
Well, I think, I mean, the software that has changed all of our lives is you know, spell check, to be honest. and being able to dictate to your computer as well. I mean, that is just marvelous. And having documents read to you as well. I think that's made a huge difference. There are lots of CAD programs out there. I'm not familiar with them. I don't use them for drawing myself. I do use, obviously I use PowerPoint, I use iMovie to make little movies. It's all very easy, I think, and understandable, as opposed to the kind of density of some of the administrative programs that one has to engage with in professional life. I think, you know, if they could be more visual, like some of the Mac programs, that would be so much easier for people. Okay. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. There's just it's sort of a little bit of a theme just running through the chat for the last few minutes. And a few people commenting on the different sides. And the simple question is dyspraxia in any way associated with autism?
Not as far as I know, no. Dyspraxia is to do with visual perceptual processing. So a typically dyspraxic child will find it difficult to do a jigsaw puzzle, for example, tie their shoelaces. If they have to wear a school uniform tie that tie, mat read. It's nothing to do with their eyesight, it's to do with how they perceive things in space. So if you think about an aerial view of a football match, so you've got the football, you've got all the people on your team, all the people on the other team, and the two goals. It's a huge visual spatial set of problems. Whereas something like tennis singles, an aerial view of that, is much easier. It's just you, the other person down the other end, the net in the middle, and a ball that, you know, is much more predictable than it would be in a football game. And that, interestingly, often affects dyspraxic children's ability with maths. They're often very good at problem solving in maths, but not good at sort of simple maths like long multiplication, long division, decimals, because it's to do with how you perceive the number in space. So if you imagine, 3,000,003, and you're going to add it to 300,030, unless you've got all the threes and the noughts in the right columns, you could end up with the wrong answer. So it's nothing to do with your ability to calculate. It's to do with how you're perceiving the number in space. And with writing, it can affect your organization of a piece of writing, because it won't be obvious to you where this bit should be compared to that bit and that bit. So, lots of our dyspraxic students come for help with their dissertations. And one of the things I can do, which is often, is very simple, but if you cut the paragraphs up, actually physically cut them up, and then sort of start playing with them, often the student can see then where this section should be. But it's when it's all in a sort of dense document, that's quite tricky.
Just in terms of, talking about dyslexia, I know this is a pure generalization, but it's often said that people with dyslexia are very good in terms of blue sky thinking. So in terms of something like that, if we went into UK in the morning and, we removed Boris Johnson from number 10, I made you the Prime Minister and said, Qona, could you redesign the education system? What would you do?
What would I do? Gosh, well, I'd bring back the arts to start with, and have much more focus on the arts, and bring the arts into other subjects. So, thinking about primary school, for example, if you were doing a project on, say, the Tudors, you could have a lesson about the Tudors, but you could, so for homework, you could write about the lesson, but I've often been moving too much because suddenly my lights registered. There's actually someone in this room. You could write about the lesson. You could draw a picture of all the things that were talked about in this lesson to do with the Tudors. You could make a poem about it. You could perhaps make a little clay or plasticine model of what you thought a Tudor person looked like. I think, opening up all the subjects to different ways of learning would be a huge benefit to not just neurodiverse students, actually, I think to all students. But then you'd have to look at teacher training, wouldn't you? Because at the moment, teacher training
is non-existent.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I'm glad you're not going to make me Prime Minister tomorrow morning.
Oh, we should. We'll take a vote. I'm sure everybody here will vote for you.
Wouldn't it be great though if we could kind of, just value creativity kind of more in that way than kind of the more traditional academic subjects and achievements?
Absolutely.
So it's so exciting to think about that as a possibility. There's just a comment that's here in the Q&A, and I think it's about kind of supporting a young person, or maybe encouraging a young person to ask for support. I'll just read it out to you here. It says, my teen will be taking a technical class in welding in high school through a local college. I'm afraid the written and reading portion will cause her to fail or not ask for help because she will be in a college course with adults. If she fails, she gets a bad mark in college credits. I'm not sure how I can help her if this issue arises.
Well, if she's got a phone, I would advise her to photograph every part of the demonstration and make a comment on it herself, so that she's experiencing the demonstration, she's photographing it and saying what's going on, because I think that will be much more meaningful to her, her own words and her own images that she selected. But also, and I know it's hard to do this, But actually, if she can be brave enough to say, actually, I'm not getting this, there'll be at least 3 or 4 other people in the group who will be so relieved that she said it and not them, because they're not understanding either. And, you know, it is really hard. It is really hard to do that. But you can always be absolutely certain that by putting your hand up and saying, I haven't understood, you're not going to annoy anyone. You know, people are going to, and actually, generally speaking, we find with students that if I've got a student who's having a real problem with one of the processes they're being taught, I'll have another student from that course also who I'm working with on their dissertation, and I can say, you know, oh, by the way, Gabriel, Sandra's having a real problem with welding. Do you think you could just take her through it, you know? And they're always really delighted to. So I think, you know, asking the teacher or the demonstrator for maybe a bit of extra help, maybe saying, you know, I'm neurodiverse, I'm finding this quite hard to take this information in. But also noting it on your phone, if you've got a phone, is really invaluable, I think, too.
That's great, thanks. And I think it's kind of interesting, you know, it's kind of as well about then the onus of the educators and the organisers to kind of create a culture of disclosure as well, and how we all kind of have a responsibility to do that. Yeah. Go ahead, Ken.
No, I was just in terms of just listening to Qona's presentation earlier. I was just noting questions that possibly may come up, and one of the one I had actually put up was asking for help, and I know you just answered it there, but the question then sort of begs itself: why are neurodiverse students not putting their hand up?
Because I think there's still a huge stigma. I mean, sadly, and also you kind of, I think you know that a lot of neurodiverse children in our schools sadly get so used to being told you've got it wrong, or why don't you listen? You know, I've told you this before, why don't you listen? Or that you can kind of get into a vicious circle of thinking, well, people think I don't listen anyway, so you know, if I put my hand up, I'm just going to get shouted at again. It's really difficult. I mean, I don't have an answer apart from sort of hoping that the world becomes more inclusive, I guess, for our neurodiverse thinkers.
Well, thank you very much. I think, Timmy, that's all the questions that are there.
Yes, we have a few minutes left, and of course there's so many excellent points being made this evening. I mean, there is the piece around creativity, and when I look back at your presentation later, Qona, I'll take a look at some of those books as well. A couple stood out, the idea of a superpower. Equally, I'm really, you know, in some ways inspired by your comment about the person, you know, the student who works in ceramics and has dyspraxia. And of course, one might think if we were to look at maybe online, we'd see some of the signs of dyspraxia. But in fact, it's interesting that some dyslexic and dyspraxic people I know seem to be excelling actually in areas. And that's why the comment on stigma, I think, is really important as well, that, you know, sometimes people will make comments. I hear comments that, you know, maybe a person can't be whatever, or they mightn't succeed in whatever, when in fact, that's not necessarily the case when we look at each individual. So I think we do need to build the more inclusive society. We do need to have structures which don't exclude. And in fact, somebody in the chat mentioned drama and a focus on reading, which in a way I get.
Yeah.
But of course, drama is also about drama and the act of acting. And then of course, art. I got to visit an art museum recently in Madrid, the Prado, and I noticed people painting and practicing, and it really was beautiful. But of course, you know, there, as you say, maybe in some educational settings, there's a focus on writing and reflection as opposed to the creation. Similarly, maybe in maths, a few weeks ago, we spoke about how reading seems to have supplanted itself in the area of mathematics. So I think we do need to look at the inclusive society. We need to look at the piece around challenging stigma, and also the piece around making sure that there are the supports there to ensure that, like those hurdles, you know, we can go up over them, maybe under them or around them. So I think it's been a really positive and interesting talk, that's for sure. And it's very good of you to give of your time this evening.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in the word of the now deceased Gay Byrne of Irish Late Show fame, we'll leave it there, folks. But I note that we have some really exciting events coming up. Actually, one we're really looking forward to, and thank you, Beth, for displaying the slide. We have a conference coming up in May, Thursday the 19th and the 20th. It's online, registration is free. We're looking at neurodiversity and the legal system. So we'll be looking at all aspects from the courts, probation, the police, the prison system, which I know has been in the news recently. And then, of course, next month, we have Magda Mustafa, Associate Professor of Design in the American University of Cairo. And we appreciate design and the physical environment and the built environment have a key role to play for all of us, both neurodivergent and neurotypical. So hopefully you can join us for some of those free events. Thank you so much to everybody for coming in this evening. A big thank you to Beth and to Ken, and of course, most of all yourself, Qona. It's lovely to actually have this, dare I say, protected time with you, as opposed to maybe catching a glimpse at a conference. It's been a lovely evening. Thank you, and best of luck in your work.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.